This is the Zodiac speaking. 5 simple words that sparked one of the most terrifying criminal cases in American history. A serial killer who taunted police, terrified an entire region, and vanished into legend. David Fincher's 2007 film Zodiac brought this nightmare back to life with obsessive detail. But how much of what you saw on screen actually happened? And after all these years, do we finally know who the Zodiac really was? I'm breaking down Zodiac scene by scene, separating the facts from the fiction, and revealing what the movie got right, what it changed, and what disturbing truths it left out entirely. The film opens with one of the Zodiac's most brutal attacks. On July 4th, 1969, Darlene Ferrin and Mike Mageau are sitting in a car at Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo, California. A vehicle pulls up, parks nearby, then leaves. Minutes later, it returns. A man emerges with a flashlight and a gun and, without warning, opens fire. This scene is chillingly accurate. The real attack happened almost exactly as Fincher depicts it. Mike Mageau survived and described the killer as a stocky white male, around 5 feet 8 inches, with curly brown hair. The killer used a 9mm semi-automatic pistol. After shooting them multiple times, he returned to his vehicle, then came back and shot them again as if to make sure they were dead. But here's what the movie doesn't show you. About 40 minutes after the attack, the Vallejo Police Department received a phone call from a man who calmly reported the crime, gave the exact location, and then added, "I also killed those kids last year." He was referring to the unsolved murder of teenagers Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday 7 months earlier on Lake Herman Road. The police traced the call to a payphone just 2 blocks from their headquarters. The killer had been watching them. After the Blue Rock Springs attack, the film shows the Zodiac sending his first letters to newspapers. On August 1st, 1969, 3 nearly identical letters arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. Each letter contained a third of a cryptogram, and the writer demanded they be printed on the front pages. If they weren't, he threatened to go on a killing spree. This is completely true. The letters were real, the threat was real, and the cryptograms were real. The movie accurately shows the newspapers printing the cipher, and then a schoolteacher named Donald Hardin and his wife Betty, cracking the code within days. The decoded message was disturbing. "I like killing people because it is so much fun. Man is the most dangerous animal of all." But here's what the film downplays. When the Hardins cracked that cipher so quickly, police actually became suspicious of them. Authorities briefly considered whether Donald Hardin himself might be the killer because he'd solved it so fast. He wasn't, but it shows how desperate and paranoid the investigation had become. One of the most unsettling scenes in the film depicts the attack on Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard at Lake Berryessa on September 27, 1969. A man in a black executioner's hood with a white cross-circle symbol approaches the couple. He ties them up, then brutally stabs them both. Cecilia Shepard dies from her injuries. Brian Hartnell survives. Fincher recreated this attack with disturbing precision. He filmed on the actual date of the attack, at the exact location, and followed Hartnell's account almost word for word. The killer did wear that hood. He did claim to be an escaped convict. He did tie them up using pre-cut lengths of clothesline, and he did stab them repeatedly before calmly walking away and calling police to report a double murder. But there's something the movie subtly changes. The film suggests Brian and Cecilia were a romantic couple. In reality, they were just friends. Cecilia had come to visit Brian at Pacific Union College, and they decided to have a picnic together. The Zodiac may have targeted them because he assumed they were a couple, fitting his pattern of attacking young lovers in secluded areas. The film shows the Zodiac's final confirmed victim, taxi driver Paul Stine, shot in the head in the Presidio Heights neighborhood of San Francisco on October 11, 1969. 3 teenagers witnessed the crime from across the street. They call police and describe the killer as a white male in dark clothing. But the dispatcher makes a catastrophic mistake and broadcasts that the suspect is black. This is all true. 2 patrol officers, Don Fook and Eric Zelms, responded to the call and actually encountered a white man walking away from the scene. Because they were looking for a black suspect, they didn't stop him. Fook even spoke to the man, who calmly told them he'd seen someone waving a gun. The officers drove on. Moments later, the dispatcher corrected the description. It was too late. The man they spoke to was almost certainly the Zodiac Killer. In a letter sent weeks later, the killer wrote, "Hey pig, Doesn't it rile you up to have your nose rubbed in your boo-boos? The Zodiac had walked right past the police and vanished into the night. The heart of Fincher's film is Robert Graysmith, the San Francisco Chronicle cartoonist, played by Jake Gyllenhaal. The movie shows Graysmith becoming increasingly obsessed with the case, spending years tracking down leads, interviewing suspects, and eventually writing a book that pointed to one man, Arthur Leigh Allen. This portrayal is largely accurate. Graysmith really did become consumed by the case. He really did spend a decade researching it. And yes, it really did cost him his marriage. In interviews, Graysmith admitted, "It affected my life in one bad way because I got divorced. But on the other hand, I have the greatest kids." As far as the personal relationship, that was not good. Zodiac was number one. That just took over. But here's what the movie exaggerates. Graysmith's relationship with crime reporter Paul Avery, played by Robert Downey Jr. The film shows them as close collaborators, working side by side on the investigation. In reality, they didn't even meet until after they'd both left the Chronicle. The film also depicts Avery spiraling into paranoia and poor health, living as a recluse. According to his family, this is false. Avery moved to the Pacific Northwest and lived a relatively normal life until his death in 2000. The movie's central suspect is Arthur Leigh Allen, played by John Carroll Lynch. The film presents a mountain of circumstantial evidence against him. He wore a Zodiac brand wristwatch with the killer's symbol. He owned the same type of boots that left prints at a crime scene. He was in possession of bloody knives after one attack, claiming he'd killed a chicken. Friends said he'd talked about hunting people for sport and calling himself Zodiac before the killings began. He was even stopped and questioned near the Paul Stine crime scene. All of this is true. Arthur Leigh Allen was the only person ever publicly named as a suspect by police. Detectives served multiple search warrants on his home over 2 decades. Mike Mageau, who survived the Blue Rock Springs attack, later identified Allen as his attacker in 1991, though his memory of that night had always been hazy. But here's the problem. The evidence against Allen kept falling apart. His handwriting didn't match the Zodiac letters. His fingerprints didn't match prints left at crime scenes. And in 2002, DNA extracted from stamps on the Zodiac's letters was tested against Allen's DNA. It wasn't a match. Robert Graysmith has defended his theory, arguing the letters may have been contaminated over the years, or that the Zodiac may have had someone else lick the stamps. But most investigators today believe Arthur Leigh Allen was not the Zodiac Killer. He died in 1992, and the case moved on. Fincher's film focuses almost exclusively on Allen, but there were dozens of other suspects over the years. The movie briefly mentions Rick Marshall, a San Francisco movie projectionist whose handwriting resembled the Zodiac's, and who had strange connections to old films with Zodiac-like themes. But the film ignores other major suspects like Richard Gaikowski, a journalist with ties to the case, and Lawrence Kane, a convicted criminal who lived near the crime scenes. The movie also downplays or omits several murders potentially linked to the Zodiac. In 1966, college student Sherry Jo Bates was brutally stabbed to death in Riverside, California. Months later, typed confession letters were sent to police and newspapers. The Zodiac later claimed responsibility for her murder in a 1971 letter, writing, "I gave the cops some busy work to do to keep them happy." Then there's the case of Kathleen Johns, depicted briefly in the film. In March 1970, a man claiming to help with her car trouble kidnapped her and her baby, driving them around for hours while threatening to kill them. Johns escaped and later identified the man as the Zodiac from a wanted poster. The Zodiac took credit for this abduction in a letter, but decades later, police began to doubt whether it was actually him. Johns' story changed over the years, and no physical evidence ever linked the incident to the Zodiac. The film shows 2 of the Zodiac's 4 ciphers being solved. The first, the 408 symbol cipher, was cracked by the Hardens in 1969. But the second cipher, a 340 symbol cryptogram sent in November 1969, remained unsolved for over 50 years. This is where the movie's timeline ends, but the story doesn't. In December 2020, an international team of codebreakers finally cracked the 340 cipher using advanced computer programs and complex mathematics. The decoded message was eerie. "I hope you are having lots of fun in trying to catch me. I am not afraid of the gas chamber because it will send me to paradise all the sooner." The solution was verified by the FBI, but it revealed nothing about the killer's identity. two shorter ciphers, the 13-symbol and 32-symbol codes, remain unsolved to this day. This is the question everyone wants answered. The movie ends ambiguously, strongly implying Arthur Leigh Allen was the killer, but offering no proof. So what do we actually know today? The case officially remains unsolved. The FBI, the San Francisco Police Department, and multiple California counties still classify it as open. But in recent years, several new suspects have emerged. In 2014, a man named Gary L. Stewart published a book claiming his biological father, Earl Van Best Jr., was the Zodiac. Stewart pointed to similarities between his father's mugshot and the composite sketch, as well as his father's initials appearing in one of the ciphers. Police reviewed the evidence and found it inconclusive. In 2021, a group of cold case investigators called the Case Breakers announced they'd identified the Zodiac as Gary Francis Post, a California man with a history of violence who died in 2018. They claimed forensic evidence and eyewitness accounts linked him to the crimes. Law enforcement agencies publicly disputed their findings, stating there was no definitive proof. Then, in 2022, author Jarrett Kobeck published a book arguing the Zodiac was Paul Duer, a man who lived in the Bay Area during the killings and had connections to several crime scenes. Again, the evidence was circumstantial. The truth is, we still don't know. DNA from the Zodiac's letters has been preserved, and investigators continue to compare it against databases and new suspects. But as of today, no match has been confirmed. The Zodiac Killer's identity remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American criminal history. David Fincher's Zodiac is one of the most accurate true crime films ever made. The director spent 18 months researching the case, interviewed surviving victims and investigators, and recreated crime scenes with painstaking detail. But even Fincher couldn't solve the case. And maybe that's the point. The Zodiac wanted attention. He wanted fear. He wanted to be remembered. And more than 50 years later, we're still talking about him. We're still obsessing over his letters, his ciphers, his crimes. In a way, the Zodiac won. But here's the most disturbing detail the movie leaves you with. David Fincher grew up in the Bay Area during the Zodiac killings. As a 7-year-old boy, he remembers police escorting his school bus because the Zodiac had threatened to blow one up and shoot the children as they escaped. That terror was real. That fear shaped an entire generation. And somewhere, the person who caused it all may have lived out the rest of their life in complete anonymity. Never caught, never punished, never identified. Just a name, just a symbol, just a ghost. If you want more deep dives into true crime films, historical dramas, and biopics where I separate fact from fiction and uncover the real stories Hollywood doesn't tell you, subscribe to this channel. I do the research so you don't have to. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.